Hi everyone. Hope your summer is going well. Like Veronica said, I'm Becky Huang. I'm from the Ohio State University in the United States. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Veronica and Lorraine for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. So my talk today is titled Pathway to Reading in Young Bilingual Children, What Language Experience and Oral Language Skills Can Tell Us. I want to begin with a confession. So I'm actually one of the children this talk is about. So I grew up in Taiwan, where I learned to read in Mandarin first, and then later learned to read in English. So Mandarin Chinese is my first language, and Mandarin and English have very different writing systems. So Mandarin is written using Chinese characters, whereas English uses the alphabetical system that requires the mapping between sound and letters. So I still remember sitting at my desk with an English reader and then realizing that some of the strategies that worked very well for reading Mandarin were not enough for reading English. So in Mandarin, it often felt like I can recognize the character all at once. But in English, I had to pay much more attention to the relationships between letters and sound. It felt like learning a completely different way of reading. So what I was experiencing was at the heart of what I study now. Learning to read in a second language can involve different challenges and draw on different linguistic resources than learning to read in a first language. And that experience eventually led me to the question I'll discuss today. So before we go further, let's step back for a moment. Why does this matter? So early reading success is associated with later educational attainment. So children who struggle with reading early in school often face increasing academic challenges over time. But I want to be careful here. Like a reading score in first grade does not determine a child's future. However, we do know that early reading difficulties often compound over time if they're not addressed. At the same time, an increasing number of children around the world are learning to read while simultaneously learning two languages. So much of what we know about reading development comes from research conducted with monolingual English-speaking children. So that raises an important question. How well do our theories and evidence generalize to children who are learning to read while developing multiple languages? And understanding how bilingual children learn to read is not simply an interesting theoretical question. It's an educational question with real consequences for children, families, and schools. So who are we talking about when we say young bilingual children? In this talk, I define young bilingual children as children roughly between the ages of 4 and 11. And these are children who have experience with more than one language in their daily lives. So for example, a child who moved to the United States and learned English while continuing to use Spanish at home. Others develop bilingualism through formal instruction. So for example, a child in Taiwan learning English as a foreign language in school. Those experiences may look very different. So one caveat before we continue, although I'm talking broadly about bilingual children, most of the evidence I'll show today comes from early elementary grades, particularly Spanish-English bilingual children in the United States. So now I would like to ask you a question. And don't overthink it, just go with your instinct, okay? English reading development can be fully understood without information about a bilingual child's home language. True or false? I'll give you about 20 seconds to submit your response, and we will come back to this question at the end of the talk and see whether the evidence change your answer. So
to note, the link is in the chat for those who just want to select it and then add their response.
All right, so we have some, and don't worry, this is not a typical assessment. You're not graded, and this is just for a presentation for fun. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next slide. We'll come back to this poll later. So roadmap. So here is what we are headed. 3 questions. First, what oral language skills support reading development? Second, how are these skills developed? And third, what do these findings mean for assessment and practice? So assessment is one of my own research interests, and I know some people in the audience, including Veronica and Lorraine and Anna Maria, share that interest. So, but more importantly, I think assessment is where the findings become consequential. If oral language skills and language experiences shape reading development, then they can raise important questions about how we assess bilingual children and how we interpret their reading performance. So let's start with the first question: what oral language skills support reading development? Of course, reading development is influenced by many factors. So researchers have studied oral language, language experience, executive function, motivation, instructional quality, socioeconomic factors, and many others. So if I ask everyone in this webinar to list predictors of reading development, we'll probably fill that chat box pretty quickly. Instead, I'm going to focus just on 2 areas, oral language and language experience. So why these 2? Because they are fundamental to bilingual development, because they are strongly associated with reading development, and also because they're potentially malleable through instruction and environment. So reading science gives us a very powerful starting point. One of the most influential reading models is the simple view of reading, SVR. This model proposes that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. So the key insight here is that reading is not simply about recognizing words. Children also need language skills to make sense of what they read. And this is one of the most robust findings in reading science. The language matters. So the simple view of reading is very elegant, simple and elegant, but it has been very influential in reading research. However, over time, researchers have also proposed modifications to the model. One particularly relevant extension of today's talk is the modified simple view of reading proposed by Peng and colleagues. So the idea is that meta-linguistic awareness, which is the ability to reflect on and manipulate language, may contribute directly to decoding, and also is closely related to language comprehension. So it can help children make sense of text in different ways. So this modified SVR raises an important question. What aspects of oral language and meta-linguistic awareness are most important for bilingual children's reading development? So bilingual children raises a number of questions that the SVR was not designed to answer. Which language of the 2 matters? And do both of their languages matter? And can language skills transfer across languages? And if so, which ones? And as researchers, our favorite answer is, it depends. And this is where bilingual reading research becomes important. So let's revisit the simple view of reading, but now through a bilingual lens. Traditionally, we think about reading development as being supported by language skills in the language of reading. So in this case, if we're looking at English reading comprehension, then the skills that would support English reading comprehension would be English decoding, English language comprehension, and English meta-linguistic awareness. However, bilingual children have access to another set of linguistic resources, the skills they have developed in their home language. This immediately raises a set of questions. Are these two systems operating independently, or can skills developed in one language support reading in another language? And if so, which skills transfer and under what conditions? In other words, the question is no longer simply whether language matters. The question becomes, how do language resources distributed across two languages work together to support reading development? So I have been saying oral language as if it were just a single thing. It isn't. And before we go further, I want to be precise about what's inside the oral language construct. So when I talk about children's oral language, I really mean two related families. So the first one is oral language proper, the vocabulary, the morphosyntax or grammar, and the narrative skills that children use to communicate. The second is meta-linguistic awareness, children's ability to step back and reflect on language itself. And as the modified SVR suggested a few slides ago, both support reading. They're just supporting reading through somewhat different routes. Meta-linguistic awareness help children crack the code, their code-related skills. Vocabulary, grammar, narratives help them make sense of what the code unlocks. So a child could be strong in one and still developing in another. And once we recognize that language is multidimensional, the next questions become, do all of these languages matter equally for reading? And do they only count if they are in English? So one of my favorite ways to study language development is through children's narratives. Narratives allow us to observe multiple language skills simultaneously in a context that is much closer to authentic language use. So the study I'm going to present next is published in 2022, and we asked a simple question. Can bilingual children's narrative skills help us understand their English reading development? Here I'm showing you my co-authors and the paper, the cover of the paper. So this study included 95 Spanish-English bilingual children in the early elementary grades. They're all from Texas, and they all came from Spanish-speaking homes. They were enrolled in Spanish-English dual language immersion program, where they receive instruction in both Spanish and English. So one note that applies across the talk is that the studies I'm about to show all draw from the same research project. The different sample sizes you will see reflect different subsets of the one cohort, not separate population. So when the findings line up across studies, read them as consistency within a single sample, rather than independent replications. So our research questions for this particular study were straightforward. Do English narrative skills predict English reading? And do Spanish skills, narrative skills, also predict English reading? So in other words, does the home language matter for English reading development? And to answer these questions, we collected oral narratives in both English and Spanish. Here you can see one of my students working with a first grader using the wordless picture book, Frog, Where Are You? And this is the script we gave the student when they, to collect oral narrative. So the child would look through the pictures and then tells a story. And as you know, working with young children is wonderfully unpredictable. Sometimes they produce very beautiful and well-structured stories, and sometimes they tell you their entire life story, including what they ate for breakfast, what their brother did yesterday, and why their dog is currently in trouble. So I would like you to hear one example, and this is a real narrative produced by one of the children in our study. So the full narrative is about 2 minutes, but in the interest of time, I'll play about 1 minute so you can get a sense of the task.
Okay, and go ahead and tell me the story. Do you want to hold it?
Mm-hmm. So once a boy had a little frog, and he put it inside a glass jar, and the frog, while he was sleeping, the frog got out of the jar. They couldn't find him anywhere. The jar got stuck in the dog's head. The dog fell off the window.
Uh-oh.
They went to go find the dog. They shouted, "Frog, frog, where are you?" They were looking for him again and again.
Tell me more. Where were they looking
again.
for him?
They were looking for him everywhere.
Everywhere.
And they couldn't find him. Then the problem was that a deer caught the boy
Uh-oh.
on his
What happened?
horns.
How did that happen?
A deer came and he ran into the deer, and then it got stuck in his horn.
Oh, goodness gracious.
So I had to stop the recording because it's too long, but you get a sense of the child's narrative. So once the narrative were collected, we then transcribe all the narrative and analyze different features of their language. So for example, we examine vocabulary diversity, which is how varied and diverse their vocabulary is. And we also examined grammatical complexity, including their use of subordinate clauses in both English and Spanish.
The recording?
So we then measure English decoding. So children would ask to read letters and words aloud, which assesses their ability to map print to sound. We also measure English reading comprehension. So they completed closed style items like the examples shown here, where they fill in the missing word in the sentence. So these items require children to draw on both vocabulary and syntactic knowledge. Here's what we found. English narrative skills predicted English decoding, which is probably not surprising. But Spanish narrative skills also contributed. In particular, children's Spanish grammatical complexity significantly predicted English reading. We also found similar patterns for reading comprehension. And again, measures from both languages were entered in the regression model. And English skills matter, but Spanish skills also contributed unique variance in predicting English reading comprehension. So these findings suggest that home language skills matter in English reading development. So we interpreted these findings to align with Jim Cummins proposed decades ago, the idea of a common underlying proficiency. So bilingual children's language skills may be distributed across languages, but they draw on shared cognitive resources. So skills developed in one language can support literacy in another language. Home language skills are not extra information, they're essential information. So now I do want to acknowledge an important limitation. The evidence I've shown comes from Spanish-English bilingual children, where the two languages share alphabetical writing systems and also many cognates. The results may be different for language pairs that are typologically distant. So one of the questions we're beginning to explore in my lab is whether similar patterns emerge among Mandarin English bilingual children, where the languages differ substantially in phonology, grammar, and also writing system. So we're just starting that work. If you email me in a year, I'll probably have some data to share with you. If you email me next week, I'll probably just have enthusiasm. So the narrative study shows us that oral languages matter, but it also raises another important question. Do oral language matters equally at every age? And does the mix change as a child grows? Think back to my own experience learning to read in English after Mandarin. When children first begin reading, much of their effort goes into connecting print and sound, but as texts become longer and more complex, readers must also understand increasingly sophisticated vocabulary and sentence structure. So that suggests that language skills supporting reading may change across development. So this study was also conducted with Spanish-English bilingual children enrolled in dual language programs. So my colleague Yishen, Shen Ye, and I became interested in a developmental question. Among all these language skills, do some matter more than others for reading comprehension? And perhaps more importantly, do the patterns stay the same as children grow older and become more proficient readers? So we asked two questions. Which skills in which language predict English reading comprehension? And does the ranking of those skills change as children develop? So we follow 57 Spanish-English bilingual children for 2 years. Like I said earlier, they're from the same project. And here are the ones we are able to follow across 2 time points. They were in grades 1 and 3 at time 1 and proceeded to grades 3 and 5 at time 2. So we use a technique called dominance analysis, which allows us to rank predictors according to their relative importance. I will spare you all the statistical details today, partly because of time and partly because nobody came to this talk hoping to learn or hoping for a detailed discussion of the dominance analysis technique. What matters is that dominance analysis lets us rank predictors by relative importance. So we measure a range of oral language skills that are commonly linked to reading. Those include phonological awareness, morphological awareness, syntax, and vocabulary in both languages. We also measure English reading comprehension. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, so don't worry about the specific measures right now. The key point is that we assess multiple language skills across both languages, and we can always come back to the details during the Q&A session. So for this study, our goal was to ask which of these skills contributed most to reading comprehension and whether these contributions changed over time. So the answer for younger readers was fairly clear. English phonological awareness emerged as the strongest predictor of English reading comprehension. English morphological awareness was also a strong second. This finding aligns well with what we know from reading science. When children are first learning to read, they need to connect letters with sounds and build efficient decoding skills. So early reading places substantial demands on phonological processing and on code-related skills. What's interesting is that Spanish morphological awareness, MA, is also a strong contributor and contributes much more unique variants to English reading comprehension than either Spanish phonological awareness or English vocabulary. The story changed as children got older. So at time 2, English morphological awareness became the dominant predictor, while English vocabulary and English syntactic awareness also increased in importance alongside English phonological awareness. So as texts become more complex, readers encounter increasingly sophisticated vocabulary and sentence structure. So in other words, readers are increasingly drawing on meaning-based language skills rather than relying primarily on code-related skills. So we also observe an interesting cross-linguistic pattern. Remember from the last slide at time 1, Spanish language skills contributed meaningfully to English reading comprehension. But by time 2, the relative importance, by time 2, the relative contribution of Spanish skills have diminished. And I want to be careful about that interpretation. This doesn't mean that children lost their Spanish skills. It also doesn't mean that Spanish was no longer important. So what changed was the relative weight of Spanish skills in predicting English reading comprehension. So by time 2, English-specific language skills become more important for explaining variation in English reading comprehension. And here is the whole story in one picture. The center of gravity moves from code-related skills like phonological awareness and morphological awareness to more meaning-based skills as children develop their reading. So taken together, these findings suggest that the language skills supporting reading are not fixed. So they evolve as children develop, and the relative importance of different language resources change over time. So here's the summary. Oral language matters. Oral language is multidimensional, and both of a child's languages can contribute. Different language skills matter differently, and that mix also shifts as children develop. So now we're moving on to the second question. If those skills matter so much, where do they come from? How are they developed? Skills don't appear out of thin air, so children develop them through experience. In fact, decades of research have shown that children's language experiences, defined as the exposure and their language use, language experiences are associated with a wide range of developmental outcomes. So language input and output predict vocabulary development, syntactic development, and also literacy outcomes. So for bilingual children, this becomes especially interesting because bilingual children's language experiences are also distributed across 2 languages. Some children hear mostly Spanish at home and then English in school. Others would use both languages throughout the day, like the children in my sample who are in dual language program. And still other children understand one language well, but they may rarely use it. So the differences in experience may help explain why bilingual children sometimes follow different pathways to reading. So I'm going to show you another study. So this is a study that I conducted with Jiyoung Choi. We examined how language experience relates to vocabulary development amongst the same sample, Spanish English bilingual children. And then we also look at how vocabulary outcomes in both languages contribute to reading. So our study included 338 Spanish English bilingual children from Spanish-speaking homes. Again, the same project. This time, the larger group of children who had the vocabulary and the language experience measures. So we asked 2 questions. First, how does children's language experience relate to their vocabulary in each language? And second, how do English and Spanish vocabulary relate to English reading? Notice the logic here. The narrative study and the shifting dominance study connected oral language skills to reading. But this study connects experience to oral language skills and then oral language skills to reading. So to measure language experience, we collected information from children, both children and teachers. So children reported the language they typically use in everyday contexts, such as on the weekends or at dinner time. They were interviewed in either Spanish or English, whichever language they felt more comfortable with. Teachers, on the other hand, reported how frequently children use English and Spanish in the classroom. So together, these reports allow us to quantify children's language experience across different contexts. And you will notice that some of the questions on the slide were written in Spanish. And I'm not going to read those aloud because my Spanish is muy poquito. But we had really, fortunately, wonderful Spanish-speaking research assistants who conducted the interview with the children in Spanish, if the children select Spanish as the interview language. So I was not the one who asked the question, and that's probably better for everyone involved. So vocabulary was assessed as well in both Spanish and English. So we used a picture naming task. So children were shown an image and asked to name the object in that target language. So for example, we may show a picture of a dog and ask, "What is this?" And the child would respond, "Dog." And the picture on the slide is actually my dog, JJ. And just to be clear, this is not one of the actual test items. I'm just using his photo as an example. He was very excited to contribute to science in some way. So in a separate session, we also asked the same type of question in Spanish. And the next picture is a foster cat I used to take care of. His name is Toby. And we use parallel measures across the two languages because that allows us to examine their vocabulary knowledge in both languages. So again, this picture is not the actual test item, but Toby made it very clear that he wants authorship on this paper. So here are the results. So what we found in terms of language experience was that there's a shift in children's language experience. So the biggest change occurred at home. As children moved from first grade to third grade, their English use at home increased substantially. That's, I guess, not surprising given the prior literature. Children spend more time in English-speaking environments than they switch to become more English dominant. However, what we found interesting was that what happened in school. English use remained consistently high, but Spanish use also remained relatively stable over time. In other words, the dual language programs were doing exactly what they're designed to do. Even as English became increasingly prominent at home, children continue to receive substantial opportunity to use Spanish in school. And before I show you the results, let me show you the conceptual model that guided our thinking. So we hypothesized that language experience would predict English reading indirectly through vocabulary. So in other words, children's experiences at home and at school serve as the roots of the system, the ecosystem of bilingual reading. And those experiences help shape their vocabulary knowledge in both languages. And vocabulary, in turn, supports reading development. This is a conceptual ecosystem of bilingual reading. And now this is one of the figures that look much more scarier than it actually is. I'm not going to walk through every path coefficient, but instead, let me highlight a few patterns that I think are particularly interesting. So English use at home and at school were positively associated with English vocabulary. But there was also a finding that caught my attention. Spanish use at school was also positively associated with English vocabulary. In other words, we found no evidence that maintaining Spanish at school was associated with weaker English vocabulary. If anything, the pattern suggests that supporting the home language and supporting English development are not competing goals. Then that observation becomes more interesting, even more interesting when we look at the next sets of results. So remember that on the previous slide, we saw that Spanish use at school was positively associated with English vocabulary. And that relationship was not mirrored in the opposite direction. English use at home was actually associated, increased English use at home was actually associated with lower Spanish vocabulary score. So maintaining Spanish at home was not associated with weaker English vocabulary outcomes, but greater English use at home was associated with lower English vocabulary. Now, this is a correlation study, so we should be cautious about making strong causal claims. But the pattern suggests that language experiences may not have identical implications for bilingual children's two languages. And that raises important questions about how we think about language use in bilingual households and how we advise families about maintaining the home language. And finally, we found that both English vocabulary and Spanish vocabulary were positively associated with English reading outcomes. It's the same pattern that we saw earlier in the narrative study, now viewed through the lens of a language exposure. Once again, home language skills were not separate from English reading development. They were part of the broader ecosystem that supported reading. And that brings us back to the larger story of the study. Language experiences shape language development, and then language development shapes reading. Experience matters because experience helps build the linguistic resources that children bring to reading. So everything I've shown you so far come from research with Spanish English bilingual children in the United States. However, similar patterns have been reported among Mandarin English learners in Taiwan. This is a study, these are studies that conducted earlier in 2020 or prior to 2020. And this is a data set I have a particular fondness for reasons you can probably guess. And there are also similar findings from Spanish English bilinguals in Mexico and Hungarian English and Hungarian German bilinguals in Hungary. So what's consistent is that the broader patterns show that language experience shape language development across different contexts of bilingual acquisition. So now, how are those skills developed? The summary for this question is language experience helps shape the language skills children bring to reading. And then experience is upstream of everything we discuss in question 1. So understanding bilingual language development is useful if it changes what we do, right? So what do these findings mean for assessment and practice? Here is what we have established. Bilingual children vary enormously in their oral language skills. They also vary in their language experience, and both are related to reading development. If that's true, then it has real consequences for how we assess those children and how we interpret what we see. And this matters because the assessment decisions we have been discussing are no longer theoretical. So in the United States, across the country, states have enacted universal early screening laws for dyslexia or for reading risks. My current home state of Ohio joined this movement in 2021. And universal means universal. So that means the laws apply to bilingual children too. So the question of how to screen bilingual children fairly is not hypothetical. It is being asked in schools right now, often by educators who are trying to make high-stakes decisions with limited information. So this raises an important question. If bilingual children's reading development is shaped by language experiences and also language skills distributed across two languages, how should that influence the way we assess them? So the first implication follows directly from everything you have seen today. So if we screen in only one language, we're looking at part of the child and treating it as a whole. So whenever feasible, early screening should incorporate information from both languages. And to screen well, we need infrastructure to make that possible. That means building a stronger developmental science base, right? So our benchmarks reflect bilingual development rather than monolingual norms. And then it also means using multi-methods. Standardized measures, yes, but integrated with parent report, teacher ratings, and progress monitoring. Now, I can already hear the practical objection. So who is going to do all the bilingual assessment? And it is a fair objection. Look at these numbers. So 1 in 4 children in the US is multilingual. Meanwhile, 87% of teachers, K-12 teachers, 92% of school psychologists, and 91% of speech language pathologists are monolingual. So the fourth implication is about capacity. We need to train educators and clinicians who are already working with bilingual children. We also need to recruit more bilingual speakers into those professions, and we need to leverage technology. So the last assessment implication brings back question 2. Language experience need to be part of how we interpret assessment results, not an afterthought. So let me make an implication concrete with 2 children. So here we have a 5-year-old bilingual children in the US, first exposure to English, first exposure to formal schooling, both at once. So she scored low on an English language and reading screener. Does she have a language disorder? Does she have language dyslexia? Or has she simply not yet had the opportunity to learn what the test assumes she has been taught? Low performance here often reflects limited opportunity, not disorder. And here is an 8-year-old in a foreign language context, 2 hours of English per week, used mostly for textbook exercise. So he scored low on an English assessment. Does that mean his ability is limited? Or maybe it means limited exposure. So same principles in both contexts. Performance can only be interpreted through the lens of language experience. So encouragingly, some policy is starting to reflect what we know from research. Here is an example from Massachusetts. And after 40 minutes of the talk, I should clarify that this MA stands for Massachusetts, not morphological awareness. So their dyslexia screening guidelines recommended considering a child's native language and language experience. They also encouraged schools to gather information about students' skills in their home language whenever possible. For practice, the implications are actually quite straightforward. Support oral language development. It is reading infrastructure, not a nice to have. Support home language. The evidence we have seen today suggests that home language development and English reading development are not competing goals. Create meaningful opportunities to use both languages can help achieve the goal of English reading comprehension. Children need opportunities to use language, not just to hear them. And whenever we interpret an assessment results, we should interpret it through the lens of the child's language experiences and also educational context. So what do these findings mean? Reading assessment and practice should consider both oral language skills children have and the language experience through which they develop those skills. So let's return to the question I asked in the beginning of the talk. So the statement, this particular statement sounds perfectly reasonable on its surface, right? If we want to know about English reading, we measure English reading. But what today's evidence suggests is that this assumption doesn't hold. In the narrative study, home language skills contributed to English reading. In the shifting dominance study, language skills supporting reading comprehension changed over time, with different skills becoming more or less important. And in the language experience study, children's language experience predicted vocabulary development, while both English and Spanish vocabulary contributed to English reading outcome. So for me, the answer is false. We cannot truly understand English reading development in bilingual children without information about their home language skills they bring to reading and the experiences that shape those skills across both of their languages. So let me leave you with the whole talk in 4 sentences. Bilingual children draw on language skills distributed across 2 languages. Those skills are shaped by the experiences each child brings. To understand how these children learn to read, we have to understand both. And our assessment practices should reflect that. That would be the conclusion for today. And I have a acknowledgement slide. So none of this work happened alone. So it takes a village. So these are the people that I want to thank, the children, families, and schools that participated, and my research collaborators. And I also want to acknowledge that some of the images in the talk were created with AI assistance from Notebook LM. So I guess in the age of AI, acknowledging your collaborators now include the software you use. And thank you very much for your attention. I would love to hear your questions.